She grew up in a small apartment in Harlem, New York, the daughter of a Basque mother and a Syrian father, in a neighborhood where the distance between where you started and where you might end up felt wider than most people were willing to try to cross. Her family had no connections to the fashion industry, no money to spare on luxury, and no institutional pathway that pointed toward the kind of career she would eventually build. She put herself through design school by working as a waitress, moved to London on almost nothing because she wanted to understand what was happening in fashion beyond the limits of what New York was showing her, and came back with a suitcase full of clothes she had brought back to sell out of a basement boutique on East 53rd Street. She built her brand slowly, stubbornly, and entirely on her own terms, in refusing at every stage to trade creative control for commercial convenience in the way that the fashion industry routinely asked its designers to do. By the time Norma Kamali was recognized as one of the most original and most influential designers in American fashion history, she had done it without a corporate parent, without a financial backer who held authority over her work, and without compromising the specific vision she had been developing since she was a girl in Harlem who looked at the world around her and believed she could make something better than what already existed. This is that story. If you are new to this channel, welcome. If this kind of story is what brings you back, hit the like button right now, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Now let us get into it. Norma Kamali was born on June 27, 1945, in New York City, and grew up in Harlem at a time when the neighborhood was one of the most culturally dense and economically complex communities in urban America. Her mother was Basque, her father Syrian, and the combination of those two cultural heritages gave the household a character that was genuinely distinct from the surrounding environment, shaped by traditions and aesthetics that had no obvious counterpart in mid-century American working-class life. Harlem in the late 1940s and 1950s was a place of extraordinary creative energy and very limited material resources, a community that produced an outsized proportion of American cultural achievement precisely because it contained so many people who had learned to build something remarkable from very little. Norma grew up inside that culture without being able to name what it was teaching her, absorbing its lessons about creativity, resilience, and the irrelevance of material starting points to the question of what a person with genuine ability could ultimately produce. Her family's financial situation was modest in the way that most working-class immigrant families of that era were modest, which meant that the household functioned, but that there was no cushion, no savings, and no inherited advantage of any kind that could absorb a setback or accelerate an ambition. What her parents gave her instead of money was a set of values rooted in both of their cultural traditions, a Basque emphasis on stubborn self-reliance and a Syrian appreciation for craftsmanship and beauty that together produced a temperament unusually well-suited to the specific kind of career she would eventually build. She was not a person who waited for permission or for institutional support before beginning the work she believed needed to be done, and that quality of determined self-direction was visible in her from an early age in ways that her family recognized and her environment did not always encourage. She was drawn to art and design from childhood, developing an eye for visual composition and a sensitivity to the relationship between form and function that expressed itself in the way she looked at clothing, at interior spaces, and at the built environment of New York City with the focused attention of someone who was not simply observing, but was already forming opinions about how things could be done differently. New York in the 1950s and early 1960s was one of the most visually stimulating cities in the world, a place where the full range of human aesthetic expression was on display on every block, and Norma absorbed that stimulation with an appetite that was shaping her sensibility long before she had any formal context for it. If you are enjoying this story so far, now is a great time to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video. There are more stories like this one coming, and you do not want to miss them. Norma's path into the fashion industry began with a decision that reflected both her ambition and the financial reality she was working within. She wanted a formal design education, and she understood that the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York offered exactly the kind of training she needed to develop the technical skills her self-directed interest had not yet given her. The tuition was not something her family could cover, and there was no scholarship or institutional support that presented itself as a solution to that problem. Norma solved it the way people in her position typically solve it, by working. She took a job as a waitress and used what she earned to pay her own way through the Fashion Institute of Technology, or as attending classes and working shifts in a parallel that required the kind of sustained discipline and time management that most 19 and 20-year-olds would have found genuinely difficult to maintain. The experience of putting herself through design school was not simply a financial transaction. It was a formative demonstration to herself of what she was capable of when the only resource she could rely on was her own effort, and it established from the beginning of her professional formation a relationship to her own work that was built on the knowledge that she had paid for it directly and personally rather than having it provided for her. That relationship to her own effort and her own investment shaped the creative independence she would maintain throughout her career with an unusual consistency. Yeah, because from the very beginning, she had never been given anything by anyone that she had not first earned through her own work. At the Fashion Institute of Technology, Norma developed the technical foundation in garment construction, pattern making, and design that her self-directed aesthetic development had not provided. The formal training gave her a professional vocabulary and a set of technical capabilities that allowed her to translate the design instincts she had been developing since childhood into actual garments with the precision and the structural integrity that professional fashion required. She was not a student who arrived at design school without ideas. She arrived with ideas that the training gave her the tools to execute, and the combination of innate aesthetic vision and technical capability that emerged from that process was the foundation on which everything she later built was constructed. After completing her studies, she worked in the fashion industry in the positions available to young designers in New York in the early 1960s, building practical experience and professional relationships while continuing to develop a design point of view that was already beginning to diverge from the mainstream conventions of American fashion in ways she could not yet fully articulate but could clearly feel. She was storing observations and accumulating convictions about what fashion could be that had no immediate outlet but that were shaping the specific vision she would eventually express in her own work. And the gap between where the industry was and where she believed it could go was becoming clearer and more specific with every year of professional experience, and the determination to close that gap on her own terms was building with a corresponding clarity. In the mid-1960s, Norma did something that required a specific kind of courage for someone with her financial background and her professional situation. She saved enough money from her work in New York to travel to London, not as a tourist but as someone who understood that the most important thing happening in fashion in that moment was happening in England rather than in America, and who was determined to see it directly rather than through the mediated version that reached New York through magazines and secondhand accounts. In London in the mid-1960s was the center of the most significant youth-driven cultural revolution in the history of Western fashion, a moment when the entire established system of how clothing was designed, produced, distributed, and consumed was being challenged and rebuilt by a generation of young designers, retailers, and consumers who had no investment in the conventions of the industry as it had previously operated. What Norma found in London confirmed and expanded everything she had been thinking about: American fashion and its relationship to the actual lives of the young women it was supposed to serve. The energy, the irreverence, the willingness to experiment with materials and silhouettes, and the fundamental assumptions of what clothing was for. So all of it gave her a context for the design convictions she had been developing, and a sense of the possibilities that existed beyond the framework American fashion was still largely operating within. She bought pieces from London designers and boutiques that she believed had no equivalent in New York, garments that expressed a freedom and a contemporary energy that the American market was not yet providing to its customers. She brought those pieces back to New York and began selling them, initially out of a small basement boutique on East 53rd Street that she opened with her then-husband, Norma Kamali. The boutique served as both a retail space and a laboratory, a place where Norma could test her instincts about what the New York market was ready for by offering it things it had not yet been offered and watching how it responded. And the response confirmed what she had believed, that American women were hungry for exactly the kind of contemporary, energetic, freedom-expressing fashion that London was producing and that New York had not yet caught up to. The boutique developed a loyal following among the fashion-forward New York women who discovered it, and the reputation it built gave Norma both the commercial foundation and the professional credibility she needed to begin the next phase of what she was building. The transition from selling other designers' work to producing her own was the natural and inevitable next step for someone who had been developing a specific design vision for more than a decade and who now had the retail platform, the technical training, and the direct customer relationships to begin expressing that vision in her own garments. As she began designing and producing pieces for the boutique that reflected the aesthetic she had been assembling through her years of formal training, professional experience, and the direct observation of what was happening in London and in the streets of New York, clothing that was contemporary, practical, and genuinely original in ways that the mainstream of American fashion was not offering. The most consequential decision of Norma Kamali's professional life was also the most difficult, and it required a willingness to trade the security of an established business structure for the complete creative freedom she believed her work demanded. When she left the East 53rd Street boutique to start again entirely on her own, she did so with the full understanding that independence would mean assuming every risk that a business partner or financial backer might otherwise absorb, that every decision about design, production, pricing, distribution, and marketing would rest entirely with her, and that the consequences of those decisions, good and bad, would be entirely hers to manage. She made that trade deliberately and without ambivalence, because she understood that the alternative, the kind of creative compromise that shared control inevitably produced, was a price she was not willing to pay regardless of what the corresponding security was worth. In 1978, Norma opened OMO Norma Kamali on West 56th Street in Manhattan. OMO stood for On My Own, is 3 words that described not just the business structure of the new venture, but the fundamental principle on which it was built, and the statement she was making about how she intended to operate for the rest of her career. The name was an announcement, a declaration of independence addressed simultaneously to the fashion industry that expected designers to work within institutional frameworks, and to the customers who would understand immediately what it meant for a woman in the late 1970s to build something entirely on her own terms. The fashion press noticed, the customers responded, and Norma Kamali, operating genuinely and completely on her own, began the most productive and most influential phase of her career. The OMO store was unlike any retail space that most of its customers had encountered, designed by Norma herself with the same aesthetic intelligence she applied to her clothing. A space that communicated a specific and consistent point of view about beauty, modernity, and the relationship between a retail environment and the products it contained. Norma had always understood, in the way that the most effective brand builders understand, that the context in which work is experienced is inseparable from how that work is perceived, and she controlled the context of her work with the same precision she applied to the work itself. Every element of the OMO experience, from the space's design to the way the clothing was presented to the atmosphere it created for the customer who walked in from West 56th Street, was the product of deliberate design decisions that expressed a coherent and specific point of view. As the collection she produced under the OMO banner in the late 1970s and into the 1980s established her reputation as one of the most original and most technically innovative designers working in American fashion, a designer whose work was driven by genuine ideas about the relationship between clothing and the body, rather than by the seasonal requirements of a commercial fashion calendar. She worked with materials that other designers of her stature were not working with, explored construction approaches that had no precedent in the luxury fashion tradition, and produced garments that served the actual physical lives of the women wearing them while maintaining a level of design sophistication and visual intelligence that the most demanding fashion critics recognized and respected. On the design philosophy that Norma Kamali built her career around was rooted in a conviction about the relationship between clothing and freedom that was specific, consistent, and genuinely radical in the context of American fashion as it operated through the 1970s and 1980s. She believed that clothing should extend the physical freedom of the person wearing it rather than constraining it, that the best garment was one that moved with the body, adapted to the demands of an active life, and maintained its beauty and its integrity under the conditions of real use, rather than simply looking impressive in a controlled environment. That belief drove her toward materials, constructions, and silhouettes that were unconventional by the standards of high fashion, but that served her customers with a directness and a practicality that more formally beautiful clothing often failed to deliver. Her commitment to that philosophy was not simply an aesthetic preference. It was a sustained intellectual and practical argument about what fashion was for and who it was serving, made through the work itself rather than through statements or manifestos. Every collection she produced at OMO was an expression of that argument in physical form, clothing that demonstrated through its construction, its material choices, and its relationship to the body of the woman wearing it. That design intelligence and genuine practicality were not competing values but complementary ones, that the most beautiful garment was often the one that worked most completely for the person whose life it was designed to serve. She was also, throughout her career, one of the most consistent advocates for the health and physical well-being of the women she designed for, an interest that extended the core philosophy of her fashion work into a broader concern for the full person rather than simply the dressed surface. She understood that how a woman felt in her body was inseparable from how she felt in her clothing, and that a designer who cared genuinely about her customer had to care about the whole person, and not simply about the visual impression the garments created. That holistic concern distinguished Norma's relationship to her customer from the more purely aesthetic or commercial relationships that characterized much of the fashion industry, and it was appreciated and recognized by the women who wore her work as something genuinely different from what most designers offered. The commercial success of Omo Norma Kamali through the late 1970s and the 1980s was built on exactly that foundation, on the loyalty of customers who felt that Norma's clothing served them in a way that other designers' clothing did not, who returned season after season not simply because the clothes were beautiful, but because they worked, because they fit into real lives with real demands, rather than requiring those lives to reorganize themselves around the clothing's requirements. That loyalty was the most durable commercial asset a fashion brand could build, more valuable in the long run than any single collection or any single moment of critical recognition, and because it was built on genuine satisfaction, rather than on the seasonal enthusiasm that the fashion industry's constant novelty machine was designed to generate and then replace. What Norma Kamali built over the course of her career was not simply a successful fashion brand. She built a model for how a designer with genuine creative vision could operate in the American fashion industry without surrendering that vision to the institutional pressures that the industry routinely applied to its most commercially promising practitioners. The fashion industry of the 1970s and 1980s operated on a set of assumptions about how successful designers needed to organize their businesses, assumptions about the necessity of corporate backing, licensing deals, wholesale distribution through major department stores, and the kind of brand extension strategies that generated revenue at the cost of creative control. Norma rejected most of those assumptions, not out of impracticality or naivety, but out of a clear-eyed understanding of what they would cost her work and a corresponding determination to find commercial models that did not require that cost. Her decision to operate OMO as a direct retail business centered on her own store rather than through the wholesale and licensing channels that most designers of her stature used, gave her a level of control over the customer experience, the product quality, and the brand presentation that the wholesale model made structurally impossible. It also made her business smaller than it might otherwise have been, because direct retail through a single flagship store reaches far fewer customers than wholesale distribution through major department stores across the country. Norma understood and accepted that trade-off because she believed that the integrity of the work required the control that direct retail provided, and that a larger business built on compromised creative authority was worth less, not more, than a smaller one built entirely on her own terms. She also pioneered approaches to fashion retail and brand communication that anticipated by years, and in some cases by decades, the strategies that would eventually become standard across the industry. Her direct relationship with her customers, her willingness to communicate with them directly about the philosophy behind her work, and her interest in the full context of their lives rather than simply their purchasing behavior were all characteristics of a retail model that the rise of direct-to-consumer brands in the internet era would eventually validate at massive scale. Norma was operating on those principles in a physical store on West 56th Street in the late 1970s, without the technological infrastructure that would later make such approaches accessible to businesses of any size, because she understood their importance intuitively rather than as a response to market conditions. The recognition that her peers and the fashion press gave her throughout the peak years of her career reflected a genuine appreciation for the originality and the consistency of her contribution to American fashion, in an acknowledgement that what she was doing was different in kind and not just in degree from what most of her contemporaries were producing. The awards, the critical coverage, and the sustained loyalty of her customer base all pointed toward the same conclusion, that Norma Kamali had built something real, something that expressed a genuine and specific vision about what clothing could be and what it could do for the women who wore it, and that she had built it without making the compromises that the industry had told her were necessary for success. The Norma Kamali story is a story about the particular kind of courage required to build something entirely on your own terms, in an industry that has strong and well-established ideas about how things should be done. And it is not the courage of the dramatic risk-taker who bets everything on a single moment, though there were moments of genuine risk in her story. It is the quieter and in many ways more difficult courage of someone who maintains a clear and specific vision across decades of professional work, who resists the institutional pressures that push toward compromise and conformity, and who builds something durable and significant through the sustained application of that vision rather than through any single dramatic act of creativity or commercial boldness. The girl from Harlem who waitressed her way through design school, who flew to London on almost nothing because she believed she needed to see what was happening there directly, who opened a boutique in a basement and built from it a brand that carried her name for decades. I proved something specific and important about the relationship between creative independence and commercial success. She proved that they are not opposed, that a designer who maintains genuine creative authority over her work does not necessarily sacrifice commercial viability in exchange for that authority, but that the commercial success built on genuine creative integrity is a different and more durable kind of success than the kind built on the institutional machinery of licensing and wholesale distribution and the brand extension deals that traded creative control for revenue at scale. She also proved something about the value of knowing what you are not willing to compromise. The fashion industry of her era offered Norma Kamali the same deals it offered every successful designer, the opportunity to trade some portion of her creative authority for the capital and the distribution that would have made her business significantly larger. She declined those deals, not once but repeatedly, because she understood that what she was building had value precisely because of the creative control she maintained over it, and that reducing that control would reduce the value of what she was building even as it increased its revenue. That clarity about what she was actually building and about what conditions were necessary to build it correctly was itself one of the most significant achievements of her career. The Harlem girl who looked at the world around her and believed she could make something better than what existed built exactly what she believed she could build. She built it without the backing, the connections, or the institutional support that most people in her position would have considered the minimum necessary preconditions for serious professional success. She built it through 30 years of focused, independent, creatively uncompromised work that changed how American fashion thought about the relationship between clothing and the lives of the women it was designed to serve. And she built it on her own, which was always the only way she was willing to build it. That is the story of Norma Kamali. And if you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. If this story gave you something to think about or something to take with you, drop a comment below and tell us what landed. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear a story like this one.